Hello YouTube! I don't know why I just did this, like Christopher Lee at the end of The Wicker Man. I have been watching a video by one of my favourite YouTubers, Patimus, who is just an awesome person and like I say, one of my favourite people on this website. So I just watched a video of hers and I'll leave a link to that video below. Go and check out her channel, go and subscribe to her, tell her I said hi. And anyway, so the video that she did was, what do you make of horror? What are your thoughts? How do you define horror personally? And I have a rather convoluted, long and boring answer to this, so get comfortable. First of all, Patimus said that her definition of horror was the absence of hope. That was sort of thematically, conceptually, that's how she sees utter horror. For me, I'm going to go at this from a different point of view. First of all, I think there's two real ways to define horror. Obviously, there's the feeling of horror, the emotion of horror, and then there's the genre of horror, which has its own tropes and conventions and all that good stuff. But for me personally, what would I think is the most? I've just kicked the camera. Sorry. What do I think is the most horrific thing, or something that defines horror? I just think utter horror. Well, bar obviously losing people that you care about and that sort of thing. Which goes down as a fear maybe more than anything else. I think there are certain psychological states which are shared with a lot of people, and there's one in particular which always interests me, and I think it's one which does freak out a lot of people, and it freaks me out, and it's the idea of fragility. It's the idea of vulnerability turned on its head. Now that's why, in my opinion, psychologically, people are frightened of sort of children in films, and I don't mean like I'm watching Home Alone. Like it's so frightening. I mean, Home Alone 3 is frightening, but that's not the point. I think that a lot of filmmakers and storytellers use the image of, say, a ghostly child to frighten the audience, because children, at least if you're an adult watching a film, children are supposed to represent something which is fragile, vulnerable, innocent, and most importantly, harmless. And when you twist that round on its head, and I've done that in a few of the stories that I've written in different ways, I think that you really make the audience feel uncomfortable. People feel uncomfortable when they watch that. So I think that idea of fragility really creeps people out. Now there's another way of doing that, and this is what maybe affects me a little bit. There's a film called Burnt Offerings. I've talked about it on this channel. It's not the best horror film ever made, but it certainly had one of the most frightening moments to me. And I'm not going to ruin it entirely, but it involves an old lady, if you've seen the film. And also there's a scene in the adaptation of Stephen King's It with an old woman who sort of turns into someone's father all of a sudden, which is quite frightening. And also the women in Room 237 in The Shining. I could go on. There's just loads of examples of that. And I think that I don't think it's a female thing. I think it's an age thing, and I think that takes a fragility as well and turns it on its head. People tend to think of people who are of a certain vintage. Maybe they become a little bit fragile, a little bit more vulnerable than they were when they were at their physical peak, and they should be kind of, I think people maybe have an image of like a sort of loving grandparent or something like that. That's something that a lot of people have fond memories of. And when you turn that on its head and you make the image of an elderly person as something dangerous, it really makes people feel uneasy. Maybe they don't even know why it feels uneasy, but it's because, in my opinion, there's just an implicit understanding that this shouldn't happen, that this shouldn't be the way things are, that it goes against it breaks down the conventions that you have in your head. And for me, I think the use of the elderly in that way in films and in literature frightens, really causes a sense of horror in me. And I think as well, psychologically, probably that's the sort of spectre of age and death as well. You know, when you think of getting older, I think you get to a certain age and you start to think, I've went past that age where you really, you don't think of yourself as invincible anymore. You don't, you know, you realise that life moves pretty fast, as Ferris Bueller once said. And I think that the idea of getting older and maybe not being what you once were is something which frightens people. When I'm not saying that that's something that people should be frightened of, but I think that's an element in that idea of using like older people in that way within horror films and in horror literature. My friend Mackie, who has recently discovered YouTube, 2012, nearly 2013. I don't have a watch, I don't know why I did that. And he's only just recently discovered what YouTube is, which amazes me. And he's been abusing my videos on YouTube by leaving comments. So he might even see this. I doubt he will, but he might even see this. But my friend Mackie and me, we always, I nearly said Mac and me, dodgy 80s reference. We used to always joke about like the most frightening thing. What would be the most frightening thing? It was kind of a game almost that we would play where you would say, right, what if this happened to you? What would you do? And there were subtle ones that always made me laugh. And one of them was this image of like you're lying awake at night, or you're lying in bed at night, the lights are off, the room's in darkness, you're facing the wall, and you're just in that little waking state, you know, when you're dozing and you're just sort of, you're not asleep, but you're not entirely awake either. You're just trying to fall back into a deep sleep. So you're facing the wall, you can't see the room behind you, you're in darkness, and then all of a sudden you hear, you know, I don't know why that always amused me, but that always made me laugh. Just the idea of like someone just like, you know, in the darkness, like, what is that? I don't know why. Maybe you had to be there for that joke. I don't know, but it amused me. But I think that's one thing that I think causes horror, is the idea of being at your most vulnerable. So you could be in a bed, you could be ill, you could be in any sort of situation where you really don't want anything to take advantage of that situation. You're not feeling at your strongest. And I think waking up at night, the idea of something being there, which is interesting. I don't know if that comes from, you know, the story that I've had most success with on YouTube is called Bedtime. It's been read, you know, over 200,000 times. It's been quite overwhelming, but the story comes from an experience that I had as a child, and it was at night. It was you know, during the night when I woke up, and I wonder if this idea of something being there in the darkness when, you know, when you really should be at your safest in a lot of ways, especially as a kid. I don't know if that's why the idea of staring at the wall and just hearing something behind you, you know. And we also we talked about bringing the elderly thing into it, like, you know, what would you do if you woke up, it's the middle of the night, and you would turn round and then there was just an old woman standing in your room. You could just see her in the light that was coming through the blinds from the street lights outside. You could just make her out. She was just standing there looking at you. I keep saying old woman. This is not a sexist thing. It could be an old guy. And Freud fans out there can make what they will of that. But I remember saying to my friend Mackie, I think he came up with that, he said, you wake up and there's an old woman there. I would probably freak out, be so defensive that I'd end up hurting her because I'd be so scared. I'd be like, what the hell is this? It's some sort of demonic thing taking the shape of an old lady or an old man. And then I would end up freaking out, throwing something at them, it would knock them out or kill them, and then it would turn out that it was a neighbour who was suffering from senile dementia, and I'd left my door unlocked and they just wandered into my house at night, and then I'd go to jail. So that would cause a lot of horror. These are really weird stories. But yeah, I think that the idea of horror, I think there are certain types of horror which are shared, is what I'm getting at. It's like a sort of collective consciousness almost amongst people, where we have these subconscious fears and anxieties. For example, I mean, loads of people fear spiders and snakes and things like that, and there are theories about why that is. Some people say we have a genetic memory where we have an inbuilt biological disgust for these things, so that we can try and get away from them because we would have been in that environment in times gone by. But yeah, I think there are shared things, and I think the idea of taking fragility and turning it on its head, that terrifies me. That really scares me. It makes me uneasy. I don't know if it's the same reason why people don't like clowns, and I can understand why they don't like clowns. Clowns scare the shit out of me as well. But I think, I mean, Patimus went more for I suppose, a philosophical idea of what horror is, in terms of, no escape, a sense of hopelessness, and I can totally identify with that. I think the idea that nothing will ever get better, which I think is what a lot of people feel, unfortunately, at certain times in their lives, and then they realise that it was a state of mind and they get out of it and things get better. But I think that, yeah, a loss of hope would be an horrific thing. But just on defining horror in terms of being like the genre itself, Eric from the Cinephiles, which is one of my favourite review shows. In fact, it is my favourite review show. Go check that out. He said something when they were reviewing Evil Dead 2, and he said that horror does not have to be frightening, and this always stuck in my mind when he said that. And he was totally correct. So when you're looking at the horror genre, there are aspects of it which, I mean, at a base level, it started by making things which would cause the feeling of horror in the audience. But cinema has been going for so long now, over a century, where we've got to the point that there are conventions now and ideas that are synonymous with horror, the horror genre. They're linked. Sorry, they're linked to the horror genre. So those conventions sometimes are present in films and in books and in plays and audio books and radio plays and things like that, which make them horror in the genre, but not actually frightening, not actually causing that fear or that experience of horror. And I think that's quite interesting. So films like Evil Dead 2, you would say, is a horror film, but it isn't frightening, and conversely, you've got films like American Werewolf in London that some people would say is a comedy, but at least in me, causes a lot of horror. I think it's a very frightening film. So I think that's really interesting about horror, the way that it's developed to the point where it can exist without causing that sense of horror. But really, when I look at genres of films, I tend to not really look at it in terms of like there being categories. I go along with Isaac Asimov here, where he said that science fiction wasn't a true genre, and I think it certainly isn't a true genre, really. He believed that you had stories and you could place them in futuristic settings, you could place them on other planets, you could place them based around technology, but really the actual human drama of it is the story. And he actually wrote a collection of stories which were all pretty much detective stories, and he sort of said that he felt that was a genre, but science fiction wasn't. So he wrote the detective stories within the the framework of science fiction to show people that it wasn't really a genre. I would go one step further and say that really there's no such thing as genre. Really, we just like to categorise and try to lump things together. So in the end, I've just undermined everything that I've said and everything this channel stands for, because it's all about horror. Anyway, I've prattled on for God knows how long. So for me personally, horror-wise, yeah, it's the turning of fragility into something sinister, which frightens me the most, causes a sense of horror in me, and obviously losing your loved ones. I think that was a great sense. That's a great sense of horror as well. So yeah, that's about all I want to say about it, because if I keep talking you will probably fall asleep. So anyway, thanks to Patimus for making that video. I'll leave a link to the video down below. I'll make this as a video response, and I'll leave a link to her channel. Definitely go and check her out. She does a lot of great vlogs, and she's always really entertaining to watch. So check out my Facebook page as well down there. I'm trying to get the Horror Mike Facebook page back up and use that as like a movie discussion page if people are interested. And I'll be back soon with some more videos. And my voice has just went for some reason. So yeah, bye for now. Oh yeah, and there's only 3 days left on my Indiegogo campaign to raise funds to help publish my book, so I'll leave a link to that as well, if you can check that out. If not, that's okay. I won't hate you. Bye for now. Which has its own tropes and conventions and all that good stuff. But for me personally, what would I think is the most... I've just kicked the camera, sorry. What do I think is the most horrific thing, or something that defines horror? I just think utter horror. Well, bar obviously losing people that you care about and that sort of thing, which goes down as a fear maybe more than anything else. Hello YouTube. I don't know why I just did this, like Christopher Lee at the end of The Wicker Man. I have been watching a video by one of my favourite YouTubers, Patimus, who is just an awesome person, and like I say, one of my favourite people on this website. So I just watched a video of hers, and I'll leave a link to that video below. Go and check out her channel, go and subscribe to her, tell her. I think there are certain psychological states which are shared with a lot of people, and there's one in particular which always interests me, and I think it's one which does freak out a lot of people, and it freaks me out, and it's the idea of fragility. It's the idea of vulnerability turned on its head. Practically, conceptually, that's how she sees utter horror. For me, I'm going to go at this from a different point of view. First of all, I think there's two real ways to define horror. Obviously, there's the feeling of horror, the emotion of horror, and then there's the genre of horror. I said hi. And anyway, so the video that she did was, what do you make of horror? What are your thoughts? How do you define horror personally? And I have a rather convoluted, long and boring answer to this, so get comfortable. First of all, Patimus said that her definition of horror was the absence of hope. That was sort of thematic.